It's always a pleasure to come to the Constitution Unit, not least because for 3 years I not only lived in Parsfield Hall, which is the LSE Hall of Residence just over the road from you, but I was the president of the hall. The only time in my life I've been a president. In fact, I have to say life has been a bit of an anticlimax since then, but it does remind me of those glory days when I was a figure of some influence in the affairs of the world. Could I also say, genuinely, that the Constitution Unit itself, has made an absolutely indispensable contribution to thinking, work, research on all these matters over the years, and I'm so glad it was recognised, I think, in Robert's Award yesterday. And you even got an honorary mention in a Guardian editorial not long since. And people like me draw on the work of the unit all the time. And indeed, you will probably know that Meg Russell here was a key part of the thinking which went into a letter that I wrote to the Prime Minister back in the summer when everybody was coming forward with proposals to reconstruct every bit of our political system in the wake of the expenses row. And when I wrote to the Prime Minister to say, look, I think we've got to respond to it in some way, certainly on the parliamentary front, and show that we can make Parliament more effective, I cited Meg's work on business. I thought she'd gone to Australia for a bit of a jolly, to be honest, but it turns out she produced a very, very important report which has contributed directly to thinking in this area. Somebody said to me yesterday, is this your swan song? And it's true that, well, let me make it clear, I am retiring, but I'm not retiring for the reasons that most people retire. We want to be seen, the early announcers want to be seen as a different category. And it's very funny, in Parliament, as some of you probably realise, when you first arrive there, and I was in my 40s when I became an MP, you find yourself described, in the newspapers as a rising star. At least I was a rising star until I read that Peter Mandelson had said that I think too much. And I realised that was a good sign. But then you blink and you suddenly see yourself described as senior, which is all a bit worrying development. And then you realise there's another category that's going to loom after that, which is veteran. And I took a vow to myself that the moment I saw the word veteran attached to my name, I would announce that I was going to retire. And indeed, I did do that. But I see since then, I've even spotted the word grandee attached to my name, which means I'm in absolute overtime at the moment. Anyway, as I said, the origins of this, I think, are pretty self-evident, which is that the House of Commons was in meltdown in the summer. In some ways, it still is. It's difficult to describe quite how demoralised it is as an institution. But part of the response to that, to the whole horrors of the expenses story, which I'm happy to talk to you about, but you don't want to, was to get people saying, well, we've got to change our system in a whole variety of ways. Yes, clean up the expenses stuff, but actually we've got to show that MPs do a decent job of work, Parliament can matter a lot more, and of course there were then many things that were said about the wider political system that needed to be done, recalls, primaries, many, many things. So it tapped into, I think, a pre-existing dissatisfaction with elements of our political and parliamentary arrangements. And I think I saw that we had to move from a situation where the parties were simply competing against each other for the next headline in terms of reform ideas, to actually try and capture the moment, to pin it down, that we could come forward with some proposals that had some chance of using this moment to produce some real change. And in some ways, the agenda of change, as far as Parliament's concerned, I think is so well known. I wouldn't weary you with reciting all the reports and inquiries on the reform of Parliament that has been over the years, and I've had a hand in some of them. Someone once said that reforming Parliament is like the weather. Everyone talks about it, and nobody does anything about it. And it just felt a bit like that. But the question was this a moment when we could do something about it? And the response came back from the government that we would have a committee that would have certain terms of reference, that I would chair it. I suggested that it should sit only for a very limited period, so it didn't just wander off into this sort of undergrowth, but had a defined task over a defined period and came back with some proposals. And quite uniquely, the parties then proceeded to elect people to sit on this committee. That is not how people get to sit on committees in the House of Commons. So it was really the actual process was quite interesting, because you had people who had been elected by their colleagues to sit on it. And so, although it was suggested to me when it was mooted that actually I might pick people, which I think was a very good idea, then I was trumped by democracy. So I'm always a bit ambivalent about democracy. But so anyway, we choose people who tend to be rather good. And so we had a very interesting committee, and we were given, I won't talk about some of the hiccups along the way in setting it up, but we were given these three major areas. You may discuss why on earth, where did these three major areas come from, but they all picked up in some way some of the arguments that have been around for a long time about what we needed to do to the House of Commons. One was in relation to the select committee system. Now, the select committees always get a good press. People like select committees. They've been going for 30-odd years, almost precisely. It so happens a report from the Procedure Committee in the last years of the 1974-79 Parliament that produced the proposals for a select committee system that was then implemented by Norman St. John Stevens when Mrs. Thatcher was looking the other way. And that's how we got the system. And it's bedded down. Nobody could envisage a Parliament now that didn't have a departmental select committee system at its heart. But in some ways, I think the system is not as effective as it might be for a number of reasons. There are others that go beyond what I'm going to say, but one reason is that we've never had a satisfactory way of deciding who gets to sit on select committees. And essentially, it is the party machines which decide. It's somewhat different in the different parties, and on the Labour side, we've improved matters somewhat after the Gwyneth Dunwoody episode and so on. But it's essentially the party machines will decide who sits on the select committees. Now, you're going to think about that for a moment to know that these are the key scrutiny committees of the House of Commons. And it simply, in principle, is not right that those who are doing the scrutiny are essentially put there by those that they're going to scrutinise. I mean, the relationship is contaminated from the beginning. That's not in any way to criticise people who do the job. Many of them go native instantly and so on. But the fact is, it's not the way it should happen if the House of Commons was genuinely having a scrutiny system that itself owned. So the question became, can we find a different way of doing it? Robin Cook suggested one approach when he was leader of the House, and it's worth remembering that even though that was really quite a modest proposal at the time that would involve a sort of panel of wise people who would be involved, that was defeated on a free vote, or a notionally free vote, in the House of Commons. So don't forget the realpolitik of this. Anyway, I think we wanted to revisit those arguments, and we spent a good deal of time working out how we might do it differently, and in particular the varieties of elective models that we might apply. How do you find the chairs of these committees, and then how do you find the members of them? And how you find the chairs and how you find the members may be different, and then actually the combinations of the two get quite complicated. And so we developed a series of options. We had a ballot actually amongst the committee members, really, because it was all, people had very different views on this. And I think we finished up probably with a position that was nobody's first choice. You know, either people wanted to do all of this or all of that. But I think we finished up with a rather sensible position, certainly for the time being, which is that we should elect the chairs of select committees in cross-house elections. Everybody should vote, because we think that would, in itself, give a huge boost to the authority of the select committee system. These people would now have a democratic mandate behind them. Nobody can say that these are the creatures of the whips or the creatures of ministers. These will be big parliamentary figures in their own right. And then we had the question of the membership, and there we finished up saying, well, I think for the time being, it would be a huge advance if we could have those elected inside the party groups on a secret ballot. We discussed whether we could do cross-house elections for those, and found for a variety of reasons it would be extremely complicated, and there would be resistance and so on. But even to get elections for the members of committees through secret ballot in the party group, just as we did to the members of this reform committee, would be a huge advance. And that would, again, I think, be a huge boost to the authority of select committees themselves. So that's the proposal that we've come up with, and that's what we're recommending. That was the one area. The second area, again, you have to start with the principle. If you don't start with the principle, it gets awfully complicated, and people don't understand what you're talking about when you start talking about intricate bits of House of Commons machinery. Meg understands it, I probably don't. But you have to start with the principle that, can it be right, at least this is how it goes with me, can it be right in a sovereign legislature to have the business of that legislature essentially controlled by the executive? I mean, that is the default position in the House of Commons. There are kind of little bits of protected time beyond that, particularly the opposition days. But there's no independent control by the House of its own affairs. And so we spent a lot of time in our report trying to discuss the nature of different kinds of business in the House, what is properly government business, what is properly not government business, and deciding that we had to have a mechanism that enabled the House of Commons at least to control its own business. And that's where we came up with a proposal for the elected House Business Committee. And we can talk in discussion about what implications that might have for different ways in which you could conduct business once you owned it yourself. We have a sentence in our report, and I think actually, right, we should confess these things, but I think the sentence we owe to Meg, actually, who said that the present arrangements infantilise members and demonise governments. And I think that's a very, very nice phrase, because it means that MPs don't have to take responsibility for their own affairs. They can simply blame governments for it, which is what goes on all the time. And then governments in turn, as it were, are responsible for things which they should not be responsible for. So the relationship is wrong. So our proposal is, let there be a backbench business committee that would control the backbench side of the House. I mean, government legislation takes up about 30–40% of House business. There are chunks of time which properly are House time, but at the moment, as I say, essentially are controlled by the government. And then we had to go on from that to think, well, okay, if we do that, how would, as it were, that stream of business connect with the business of the House as a whole? We were determined all the way through, for all kinds of reasons, good and bad reasons, to ensure that we would understand the need for a proper balance in all that we argue. The balance is this: governments elected have to have the ability to put their business before the House of Commons in proper time and have a good chance of getting it through. That is what governments expect. That's what the democratic mandate gives you. But what they don't have the right, because of that, is to control all the ways in which the House considers that business. So we went on to link the idea of a backbench business committee with a House committee House Business Committee, where the backbench committee and, as it were, the main parties would come together to agree. We didn't want it to be a voting committee, we wanted it to be a committee where simply people came together and agreed what the different claims were to House time in the period ahead. That will be the bit, I think, that perhaps the government, any government, will have more difficulty with, and which exercised us greatly during our deliberations. I noticed before I came out, by the way, in Prime Minister's Question Time, when Gordon Brown was asked about this, he said he wanted to give a warm welcome to this report. And then I think he added, and some of its proposals. And I suspect that's one of the areas that we're going to talk about. And because we've got to be able to get some purchase on the way in which some of the inadequacies of the way in which the House considers legislation. It wasn't our primary focus, but the way in which the House does its business is conducted now. Jeff Rooker, my old colleague and friend, Lord Rooker, made an interesting speech in the House of Lords this week, where he said that, given the constant dissatisfaction with the amount of legislation that comes from the Commons unscrutinised, that he thought the Commons should provide a certificate to the Lords saying that those bits of legislation which had not been scrutinised. That is a very interesting proposal.
Shame.
And I think it's something that would connect directly with what might come out of the kind of machinery that we're recommending. And that would have an enormously salutary effect on the problems that we have now, where we have acres of stuff, particularly on report stage, when the only chance the House gets as a whole collectively to look at bills, where acres of stuff does not get considered at all, and it simply gets sent along to the House of Lords. And then when lots of stuff comes back from the House of Lords, it doesn't get properly considered either. So I think if two houses together can start to do some serious business on that, I think that's a very fertile suggestion. But unless we can get the kind of machinery that we're recommending here, we haven't got the mechanism at our end, even to do anything about that. So that's the point of this. So that's the second area. And then very thirdly, which is one that we weren't entirely sure why we were giving it, except that it perhaps was unfinished business in some way, and also it showed that we had to look outwards and not just inwards. There are issues about how the House could connect better with the public outside. I mean, our argument essentially is, if we do the things that we recommend in our report, the House will necessarily be able to connect better with the world outside, because it will have more control over its own affairs. So if people ask the questions, why are you not debating this? Or why are you not voting on that? Well, we'll have the answer in our own hands from now on. At the moment, we don't have the answer to that. The answer essentially is, which we dare not say, because the government won't let us. That is not. So I think the real answer to the increased external engagement is, I think if we can do some of this, it will answer a lot of the issues. But there are other problems about the inadequacy of the petitioning system at the moment, and whether we can improve that, and make some suggestions about that. And we also suggest a model whereby a different kind of motion can be presented, so that if it gets enough signatures and members then sign up to it, comes from the outside, members sign up to it, it would have some claim on the attention of the House for a debate and possibly even a vote. We have this absurd early day motion system at the moment, which is, is a kind of parliamentary graffiti. We said, well, leave that alone, it serves its own purpose, but let's find another mechanism that can act as a kind of more formal transmission belt from outside representations to business of the House. So that's the package. I'm just going to end. When I was end with this just general thought. When I was had to do this on the Today programme yesterday morning, Justin Webb asked me, because Justin Webb comes from an American background, he asked me whether this wasn't really, whether this was realistic in a system where we don't have a separation of powers. The subtext of the question really is, do we necessarily have an enfeebled parliament in a system, in our constitutional arrangements, where the executive is formed out of the legislature? Didn't get quite that highfalutin on the Today programme, but that's the proposition. And it's a very, very good question, to which I don't have the answer. All I do know is, I don't think we've yet tested that argument. I don't think we've yet reached the limits of what we can do, by any means, inside our system. There will always be the constraints of the kind of constitutional arrangements that we have, and there may be a case for revisiting the underpinnings of our system. And in some ways, we're beginning to do that. Now that Prime Ministers, Gordon Brown conspicuously, are deciding that they would like to appoint more people from outside Parliament to government, we're beginning to move in that direction, as long as we match it with building in the accountability too, because I think we do suffer from the fact that we recruit government in this country from a very narrow pool. So I think there's a strong argument for saying, can we widen the pool? It takes me wider than I need to go, but can we widen the pool as long as we build in the accountability of these people? So I think it's an interesting developing area, but part of that is this question of, well, does the Commons have to be like it is because of the way in which our Constitution works? So I don't know the answer, but I think if we were to go down the route of the kind of things that we're recommending, we'd at least find out how far we can push the model in a direction that I think does genuinely reinvigorate the House of Commons, even within the constraints of the way in which we do our Constitution here. So that's where I will end.